I don't remember exactly when I stopped dreaming about baseball. Might have been during my 4th year at the Amazon Fulfillment Center, around the time my shoulder decided it would never again let me pitch a ball over 70 miles per hour. Or maybe the dreams ended the day I realized I was just another cog in a corporate machine, pushing crates instead of chasing a championship. It's hard to pinpoint an exact moment when reality chokes the last breath of ambition out of you. But that morning, the one that changed everything, started the same as any other for a forklift operator nearing 52. I woke at 4:30, rubbed the ache in my shoulder, and tried not to think about how close I'd once been to a minor league contract with the future. By 5 a.m., I was driving down the same half-finished stretch of interstate, passing the same decaying billboards, sipping the same burnt coffee from a travel mug. My daughter, Alexis, had texted me the night before, but I'd only skimmed it. Something about a protest, something about uncovering a new scandal. She'd grown more and more distant over the years, convinced I'd sold out. In my weaker moments, I wondered if she was right. I arrived at the warehouse a little before 6, as always. Officially, my shift began at 6:15, but the bosses liked us in early to run safety checks. Mostly, it was a chance for them to bark instructions or slip in extra tasks off the clock. I used to complain, but it never amounted to much. A mortgage, my daughter's tuition, and the steady hum of adult responsibilities. It's amazing what you'll put up with in exchange for a dependable paycheck. I grabbed my forklift from the inbound docks. The building was massive, 5 stories of steel shelving, conveyor belts, and bright overhead lights that hummed like a hive of worker bees. The break room coffee was stale, but at least it was warm. I chugged a cup, forced a yawn, and tried to shake off the heaviness in my joints. As I eased the forklift into position by receiving bay 12, an uneasy feeling prickled the back of my neck. Something about the air felt different. It had a bitter metallic tang, like the aftertaste of old pennies. I coughed once, half expecting dust. The vents above me rattled, spitting out a cold draft that sent goosebumps along my arms. My gut told me to mention it to the inbound manager, but I hesitated. The last time I pointed out a problem, I got an extra shift for my trouble. "Morning, Frank," came a tired voice. I glanced over to see Sam, a longtime co-worker, stepping off his own forklift. He was about my age, maybe a few years younger, with a perpetually worried expression that only softened when he talked about his kids. We often commiserated about the perpetual freeze on wage raises. "You notice the air tasting weird?" I asked, flexing my shoulder. That old pitching injury flared whenever I was uneasy. Sam gave a half shrug. "Could just be the heaters on the fritz again. I swear, they never fix anything around here." He looked like he wanted to say more, but a shout from the next bay drew our attention. A new shipment had arrived, and a supervisor was barking for more unloaders. Sam nodded at me and headed off. I slid my forklift into gear, trying to dismiss the shiver that slid under my skin each time the vent rattled. Just another day, I told myself. I'd barely loaded a second pallet when, in my peripheral vision, I saw Sam double over. He braced himself against a metal rack, trembling so hard that the entire row of boxes shook. I shut down my forklift. "Sam?" I called, stepping closer. A few other workers glanced over, but no one made a move yet. We'd all seen employees collapse from exhaustion or dehydration. Sometimes it was just skipping breakfast. But Sam's face was flushed dark red, and he clutched at his shirt collar as though suffocating. His eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and then he collapsed to his knees in a spasm. The metal shelf behind him clanged as he thrashed, and a forklift beeped in alarm nearby. "Somebody get a medic," I shouted. Marta, a stocky woman from Outbound, came running. She reached Sam at the same time I did. He convulsed so violently that it jolted me backward when I tried to grab his shoulder. Veins bulged along his neck and face, dark and pulsing, like something was creeping under his skin. "What's happening?" Marta cried, fear etched on her face. Sam let out a breathless moan, pitched low and inhuman, his lips curled back like a snarling dog. Marta yelped, stumbling away. Sam's head whipped toward her, and before I could even process what was happening, he lunged. He sank his teeth into her shoulder with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the polished concrete, and Marta's shriek tore through the air. I staggered backward, almost slipping in the pool of red that formed under her. My mind refused to believe what I'd just seen. Sam, the gentle father of two, was literally tearing into a co-worker's flesh. Every rational thought vaporized. "Stop!" I shouted, but Sam ignored me. He pinned Marta to the ground as she howled in agony, arms flailing uselessly. Another worker tried to yank him off, only for Sam to snap at his arm. Suddenly, an alarm blared above the usual clamor, the shrill wail of a facility-wide emergency. I'd grown used to typical fire drill bells or forklift collision beeps, but this was different, deeper and more urgent, a siren that pulsed in my chest. Then came a jarring mechanical voice over the PA. Biohazard protocol activated. All personnel remain calm. Lockdown initiated. Metal shutters began slamming down over each bay door, each exit. One slammed just behind me, the impact rattling the floor. Workers shrieked and tried to escape under the gates. One forklift driver raced for a partially open shutter, only to have it crash down on the vehicle's roof with a hideous squeal. Sparks flew, and the driver scrambled out, wide-eyed. The forklift I'd abandoned beeped incessantly, as if it too sensed the panic. A woman's voice cried for help over by the assembly area. My eyes locked on Sam again. He'd stopped biting Marta, who lay motionless now, blood soaking her vest. Sam's mouth and chin glistened with crimson. His breath heaved, and for a moment his gaze flicked to me. Through the haze of violence, I saw something like terror in his eyes, and his cracked lips moved. "You knew," he whispered. The words were raw, accusing. What did he mean? Before I could make sense of it, he lunged again, this time toward me. I reeled back, heart thundering. Shouts and screams battered my senses. Half a dozen people sprinted across the floor, some clutching wounds, others dragging injured co-workers. A forklift careened into a metal rack, toppling it with a thunderous crash. I ran. It wasn't heroic, but survival instinct took over. I scrambled around a half-lowered shutter toward a side corridor, slipping on blood as I went. I glimpsed Sam, bounding after a terrified co-worker. Another infected person, her hair matted with blood, tried to scale a forklift to reach the driver perched on top. Some rational part of me understood I was locked in. Every door, every shutter sealed. The question wasn't how to get out, but how not to die in here. Or worse, become one of those things. My phone buzzed in my vest pocket. Without stopping, I checked it. Emergency alert. Biological outbreak. Warehouse is in lockdown. Strict quarantine in effect. Failure to comply will result in disciplinary action. Disciplinary action? I almost laughed. We were trapped, playing cat and mouse with monstrous co-workers, and the corporate had the nerve to threaten us with disciplinary action. Over the alarm, I heard one final echo of Sam's voice in my head. "You knew, didn't you?" I had no idea what he meant, yet it felt disturbingly plausible. The forklift accident years ago. The hush-hush productivity boosters, the corporate secrets. In my mind, a question formed. Did I help cause this? I forced myself forward, shoving open the door to the break room corridor, nearly tripping over a scattering of plastic cups. My only plan was to find someone, anyone, who might have answers. The overhead vents rattled, spewing more of that metallic air. My lungs itched. I clutched at my left shoulder, wincing, the old injury throbbing as if I'd pitched a full game. I stumbled into the corridor that led to the break room and adjacent offices. The door labeled Break Room A stood half ajar. Inside, harsh fluorescent lights revealed a jumbled space of overturned chairs, spilled vending machine snacks, and a cluster of frantic survivors. An improvised barricade, tables, and a toppled fridge, blocked a second doorway. I paused in the threshold, panting hard. A woman in a stained lab coat spotted me and rushed over, brandishing a scalpel as if it were a weapon. I raised my hands, alarmed. "I'm not infected," I managed between gasps. Her eyes flicked over me. The name on her ID badge read Dr. Helga Jackson. I recognized the name from mandatory safety briefings, though we'd never spoken more than a few words. She exhaled, nodding. "Come in, but be quiet," she said. "We're dealing with injuries." A cluster of about 10 people were huddled in one corner. Some cried softly. Others clutched makeshift bandages to bleeding limbs. Near the center of the room, 2 men carefully held down another co-worker writhing on the floor. It reminded me too much of Sam's transformation. Jackson jabbed a thumb at that pinned man, voice quavering. "He's infected, but not fully turned. We think. Maybe we can learn something if we watch the infection in real time. There might be a way to slow it." I glanced at the others, noticing how they all recoiled from the convulsing figure. "We can't just keep him alive if he's dangerous." She grabbed my arm. "He could be our only chance at understanding this outbreak." The corporate memos, well, they never mentioned anything on this scale. The idea was just mild neural compliance, not cannibalism. Neural compliance? My gut twisted. Vigilant gas. "You're talking about that rumor, right?" She nodded, pressing a palm to her forehead. "Yes, except it's more than a rumor. They started small, feeding the formula into the HVAC to boost productivity. It was supposed to keep workers from slacking, lower union talk, all under the radar. But it's mutated somehow. I suspect the recent formula tweak triggered this hyper-aggression. I never thought it would spiral into, well, what you saw out there." A muffled scream made me spin. The pinned man seized with new vigor, snapping at the employees restraining him. Jackson grimaced. "I'm going to examine his brain responses. If we sedate him, we lose the active progression. We need that data." "You mean dissect him while he's conscious?" "It's our only shot," she said. "Help me hold him still." Her gaze swept the room, but most people were too shell-shocked or horrified to volunteer. I swallowed hard, stepping forward. The pinned man's name tag read Ted, his face contorted with raw fury one moment and slack, drooling emptiness the next. I knelt beside him, nodding at the 2 men holding his arms. Together, we pressed him down. Dr. Jackson hovered with a scalpel, an expression of grim focus on her face. Ted's body trembled beneath my grip. "Be ready," she whispered. She made a shallow incision near his temple. A gush of dark fluid mixed with blood. Ted let out a tortured wail. His back arched, nearly dislodging me. The second the blade broke skin, something outside the break room responded. I heard a collective moan, a chorus of infected howling through the corridor walls. It was as if they sensed his pain. A crashing impact against the barricade made everyone jump. I pressed harder on Ted's shoulder. "They know we're here," I shouted. Jackson frantically probed the wound, trying to observe the infection's path. Ted's eyes flickered with sudden, startling clarity. You're the liar," he rasped, voice trembling with agony. "Forklift, accident. You lied." My blood ran cold. I'd dreaded the memory for years, a fatal forklift malfunction that management insisted we label as the victim's own fault. I'd been cajoled into signing the safety report with conveniently ambiguous details, all for the company's bottom line and my own job security. But I'd never connected it to any broader conspiracy. Ted's pupils expanded. One of the men restraining him loosened his grip. That was all Ted needed. He twisted free, snapping his head up with savage strength. Jackson recoiled in alarm, dropping her scalpel. In the same instant, Ted lunged at me, mouth open, teeth bared. I reacted with pure reflex. My right arm swung upward, catching him under the chin. He grunted, but it barely slowed him. His nails raked my vest. I grasped the first thing I could, a battered metal tray from the improvised medical kit. and smashed it against his head. The impact made my shoulder scream with pain. Ted slumped, dazed for a heartbeat. Then he roared again, knocking me back onto the tile floor. Jackson shouted for help. A second infected co-worker, only halfway turned, had broken free from a corner. Chaos exploded in the break room. In a panic, I grabbed the scalpel from the floor. Ted charged, teeth bared, and with a choked cry, I thrust the scalpel into the side of his neck. We both fell in a heap. He twitched, letting out a ragged, dying gasp. When I pushed myself up, hands shaking, Ted lay motionless, eyes still open. A sickening hush fell over the break room. Jackson stared, eyes wide, a mixture of horror and frustration twisting her features. "That was our best chance at studying a live subject," she whispered. "Better me than him," I shot back. "He was trying to kill us all." A crash against the barricade startled everyone. It splintered, and I saw rotting hands clawing through. The infected from outside had heard the commotion. Dr. Jackson's face went pale. "They're coming. We have to move, or we'll be trapped." I noticed, near the battered mini-fridge, a spread of folders that had spilled from a manager's bag. One folder had a big red label, Emergency Containment Procedures. I snatched it on impulse. If I learned anything from working here, it was that emergency protocols rarely meant anything good for the rank and file. Just as I stuffed it into my vest, the barricade gave way, sending broken tables and chairs skidding across the floor. A dozen infected rushed in, limbs contorted and eyes gleaming with predatory hunger. Jackson shouted for everyone to run. Screams filled the air. Some people were too wounded or terrified to move, and I felt a stab of guilt leaving them behind. But survival instinct forced my hand. Clutching the makeshift scalpel and the folder, I followed Jackson through a back door that led to the next corridor. My phone buzzed with another chilling alert. Biohazard still active. Do not attempt to exit. Failure to comply may result in termination, as if we weren't already in the jaws of death. Jackson and I hurried through dim corridors, ducking behind towering shelves. A few other survivors tagged along, but fear drove most to scatter. The overhead vents hissed in a rhythmic cycle, pumping that contaminated air. We reached a cross-section near the packaging area, where lines of conveyor belts merged the inbound and outbound flows. In the confusion of the lockdown, half-filled boxes and shipping labels littered the floor. We slowed, noticing a group of about 10 people standing in the aisle ahead. But something about them was off. They weren't aimlessly shuffling like the infected I'd seen. Instead, they held themselves upright, grips tightening on tools like crowbars and box cutters. Their eyes gleamed with a predatory focus, and they wore Amazon IDs caked in dried blood. Leading them was Melinda, a forklift supervisor I vaguely recognized. She had short curly hair and a posture that once commanded respect in the warehouse. Now her eyes were rimmed with red, and she tapped a metal pole on the concrete floor at a measured tempo. When she saw us, she lifted the pole, signaling the others to part. "Frank Henderson," she said. Her voice sounded calm, too calm, with an eerie undertone that raised every hair on my neck. "We've been waiting." Jackson stiffened. "You're infected," she managed. Melinda gave a thin smile. "Adapted. We're not mindless. Reeve has shown us the next stage. True workplace harmony. If you'll accept the new order, you'll join us." I caught sight of a familiar figure among them. Daniel, a co-worker from Inbound who used to chat with me about forklift repairs. His face was gaunt, eyes bloodshot, but he managed to speak. "Frank, come on, man. There's no point resisting. Reeve has a plan." A chill slithered along my spine. "Reeve? So he's behind this?" I asked, voice shaking with anger. Melinda nodded. "Executive Vice President. Visionary, really. Vigilant gas is only stage 1. Those who can't adapt become savage feeders, while those with authority remain coherent." She surveyed Jackson. "You're medical staff, aren't you? Reeve needs people like you, if you're willing to serve." Jackson recoiled in disgust. Serve? This is madness. People are dying. Melinda's smile flattened. Evolution is harsh, but the chain of command is everything. The lower level infected respond to superiors. Reeves stands at the top. We intermediate managers are next in line, guiding the workforce even in death. I recalled Sam's lucid moment, Ted's last accusations. All these bizarre transformations had a method, a twisted version of the corporate pyramid enforced by this infection. My hand gripped the folder in my vest, the partial meltdown instructions, the hush-up references. It suddenly all made awful sense. Jackson stepped forward, pipe raised. Where is Alexis Henderson, Frank's daughter? We know she's here. Melinda glanced at Daniel, who shifted uneasily. Another infected worker, presumably from Outbound, whispered, "She tried to sabotage something. Ran off." A light flickered in Melinda's eyes. "Your daughter is tenacious, Frank." She was investigating the real nature of vigilant gas, stirring unrest. Reeve wanted her brought in for reprogramming. But she's on the run. She paused, then reached behind her belt to produce a torn vest, spattered with dark stains. The name Alexis was stitched on the front. "What did you do to her?" I rasped, stepping closer in alarm. Melinda shook her head, dropping the vest at her feet. "We didn't catch her. She escaped. But she's already infected, though partially. Reeve says the infection's incomplete for those who resist. Eventually she'll weaken, and the virus will finish rewriting her instincts." Melinda's gaze locked on me. "Unless you help us, Reeve can stabilize her condition, along with yours." I stared, fury swirling in my chest. She offered a monstrous deal. Join Reeve's new undead hierarchy. Watch them enslave more workers, and in return, maybe save Alexis from the mindless horde. Jackson tensed beside me, clearly ready to fight, though we were outnumbered by these half-lucid infected. One of Melinda's subordinates stepped forward, offering me a box cutter as if it were some ritualistic blade. "Prove your loyalty," he said, voice hollow. "Kill Dr. Jackson or anyone else who won't adapt." Revulsion nearly choked me. I noticed Daniel wincing, remembering the man he'd been. "Frank, we have to do what they say. Reeve can fix it," he whispered, half in disbelief. My only response was to shake my head. "I can't. I won't." My thoughts whirled with images of Alexis, stubborn, idealistic. Everything I used to be before life wore me down. I had to find her, Melinda sighed, sliding the vest aside with her foot. "A pity. I hoped you'd be smarter. I know your history, Frank. You once covered up a death that helped Reeve refine vigilant gas." She offered a chilling smile. "One more betrayal would be easy, no?" My fists clenched. I wanted to lash out, to scream that I'd never meant for any of this. But Jackson tugged my sleeve, whispering urgently. The tension thickened in the air. Finally, Melinda stepped back, lowering her pole. "Go then. Keep stumbling in the dark. When you realize there's no way out, remember our offer." She let out a soft laugh. "And remember that Alexis is running out of time." The infected parted like a living gate. I hesitated, half expecting them to attack. None of them moved, though I saw hunger in their eyes. It was as if they'd been ordered not to kill me yet. I motioned for Jackson, and we slipped past. The moment we crossed into the next aisle, Melinda's group closed ranks again. We didn't speak until we were several rows away. Finally, Jackson exhaled. "They're letting us go?" I rubbed my temples. Reeve must want me alive for something. Maybe my forklift knowledge. Or because of Alexis. "She's infected," I murmured. "I have to find her before she turns." "Then let's move. We'll check the offices. Maybe there's a clue about her whereabouts." We hurried on. I remembered that forklift accident, how I'd signed those documents to save my own job, unwittingly fueling Reeve's expansions. If he'd known Alexis was fighting him from the start, then this entire crisis was more personal than I'd realized. We entered a hallway lined with manager offices and cubicles. The floor here was carpeted, muffling our footsteps. One office door stood ajar, so we slipped inside. It was larger than most, with a sleek metal desk, multiple monitors, and a wide window that overlooked the shipping floor below. On any normal day, a manager might have stood here, evaluating forklift schedules or scanning performance metrics. I spotted a blinking computer terminal. Its screen displayed a partially open folder labeled Operations Confidential. Jackson dropped to her knees behind the desk, rummaging through loose papers. "We need more about the meltdown procedures," she said, "or anything referencing Reeves' plan." I tried the computer. Surprisingly, it wasn't locked. Within seconds, I was staring at a list of internal video files. One was titled Vigilant Gas Strategy Meeting. "Look at this," I said, clicking it. The screen sparked to life, showing a grainy boardroom feed. Brendan Reeves stood at the head of a conference table, addressing a handful of suited executives. His voice was calm, almost hypnotic. The forklift incident proved that targeted exposure can be contained if we control the narrative. Frank Henderson's testimony conveniently placed fault on the deceased. No lawsuits or external audits. That means we can proceed with Phase 2 of vigilant gas deployment. Reeves' voice continued. "With fear as our greatest tool, compliance increases. If employees believe safety issues are their own fault, they won't question the system. We'll pilot a broader release in the main HVAC soon. The experiment can refine hierarchy-based responses, maximizing productivity." The video ended abruptly. I felt numb, the memory of signing those hush forms flooding back. I'd assumed it was typical corporate spin, burying a negligence case, but it had been a stepping stone for vigilant gas all along. Jackson's lips parted in shock, but no words came out. Finally, she spoke. "You had no idea, did you?" I shook my head, throat tight. "I just followed orders. I thought I was protecting my job. I never realized they were using that accident to justify more experiments." Before she could respond, an alarm blared in the corridor. Something heavy was approaching. Jackson snatched up some loose memos, scanning them. "One of these mentions a kill switch if the gas is tampered with," she said, voice unsteady. "A meltdown protocol that permanently seals the facility." She looked up at me. "Reeve would rather bury us all than let this leak outside." My phone buzzed. The same dreaded text repeated with slight variations. "Severe hazard. Facility meltdown possible. Remain at your stations." I ground my teeth, snapping the phone shut. "We're not staying put." On a side monitor, a live security feed cycled through different warehouse angles. Through the static, I glimpsed a sub-level corridor with large pipes overhead. I could hardly believe my eyes as I saw the figure on the screen. Alexis stumbling along, blood staining her t-shirt. She was fiddling with a metal panel labeled HVAC access. Another infected shape lurked behind her, pounding on a locked door. The feed crackled with muffled screams. "Alexis," I breathed, leaning closer. She wore a look of desperate focus, as if she knew time was running out. Jackson watched the feed, eyes wide. "She's in sub-level B, near the main ventilation room. If she shuts it off or changes the flow, the meltdown might trigger." Alexis had always been the brave one. She studied activism in college, but her real passion was tearing down systems that exploited people. She must have snuck in to investigate rumored abuses. Now she was alone down there, likely infected, trying to sabotage Reeves' operation. "We have to get to her," I said, voice shaking. Jackson nodded, rummaging a final time through the desk. "Take this," she said, tossing me a small ring of keys with a manager's ID. "It might open some locked passages. I'll check the corridor for that thing we heard." She cracked the door. Beyond, the corridor was dimly lit, no sign of movement. I spotted a fire axe mounted on the wall, labeled "In case of emergency." Scoffing at the irony, I shattered the glass with my elbow and pulled the axe free. Jackson nodded at the door. "We can't stay. Let's get to sub-level B." The route to sub-level B led through a service elevator and then a series of maintenance tunnels. the walls darkened by random scorch marks, as though parts of the system had overloaded. Jackson and I crept along. Now and then we heard scuttling footsteps, but the corridors were mostly deserted, as if the infected preferred the main floors. According to the camera feed, Alexis was somewhere near the sub-level generator, trying to isolate the HVAC or shut it down. If she succeeded, she'd kill the gas flow, but possibly trigger the meltdown that Reeve built as a failsafe. We found the generator room after navigating a narrow corridor filled with stacked crates labeled spare filters. The door hung off its hinge, bent inwards. Faint light spilled from inside. On the far side, near a control panel, stood Alexis. Blood matted her hair, and her face was drawn with exhaustion, but she was upright, tapping frantically at the console. Between her and us crouched half a dozen infected figures. They didn't attack or shuffle randomly. Instead, they stood in tense stillness, as if waiting for a signal. One wore an armband scrawled with "whistleblower." His face was half twisted, eyes shining with a tortured awareness. At our arrival, he and the others turned, exhaling raspy moans. Alexis jerked around, brandishing a wrench. For an instant, I saw terror flare in her eyes, then relief. "Dad?" she mouthed, voice lost in the generator's roar. I rushed forward, ignoring the alarmed hiss from Jackson behind me. The infected parted slightly, eyeing me warily. Alexis clung to the console, breathing in short bursts. A gash on her arm seeped fresh blood. "How bad are you hurt?" I shouted, scanning her face. She shook her head, tears pooling in her eyes. "Bit or scratched?" "Can't remember. I can feel it inside my head, telling me to obey." Her voice cracked. "I keep fighting it, but it's so loud." I gripped her uninjured shoulder. "You're holding on. That's what matters. We'll find a cure or something." The thought sounded naive even as I said it. The whistleblower stepped closer, his movements jerky. He eyed me with a bleak understanding. "Don't sabotage the system completely," he growled. "Reeve installed kill switches, meltdown. Then no one escapes." Alexis nodded. "I realized that. If I shut it all down, we're trapped. But if I let vigilant gas keep running, the infection spreads faster." She slumped, glancing at the pipes overhead. "We're damned either way." My mind raced. "Is there a partial option? Can you reroute the gas, isolate certain areas?" She pointed to a secondary panel. "I think so. If I flood the executive wing, Reeve and his managers get the worst of it. But that might strengthen them if they can survive higher doses. Or it could break their hold if it's too intense." Before I could respond, the whistleblower lurched. A pained moan tore from his throat. He pressed his palms against his temples, as though battling commands in his skull. "Don't do it," he pleaded, half lucid. "You have no idea what it'll unleash. The meltdown, or the next mutation." I saw Jackson creeping around the perimeter, pipe raised. The other infected bristled at her movement, but didn't immediately attack. They seemed torn, caught between a new directive and old memories. Clearly we were one misstep away from a bloodbath. Alexis's face contorted in indecision. She gazed at me. "Dad, I don't know who to sacrifice." I remembered the meltdown file, Reeve's boastful remarks. If he had any chance to remain in power, he'd let the meltdown go off and bury all evidence. My gaze flicked to the overhead pipes. That metallic stench was stronger here. The roar of the generator made everything feel on the brink of collapse. Footsteps scuffed behind me. The whistleblower lunged, arm extended toward the console. "Stop! Meddling!" he croaked. I whirled, brandishing the fire axe. We collided in a tangle of flailing limbs. He stared at me, eyes wild with desperation, not pure hunger. "You're making a mistake." He bared his teeth, but there was a frantic sorrow in his gaze. My weight pressed him back against the metal railing. In the corner of my eye, I saw Alexis flinch, hand hovering over the reroute command. The other infected tensed, shifting to respond to some unspoken call. Fury and anguish tangled in my chest. My arms trembled, fighting the whistleblower's unnatural strength. With a shout, I twisted free, then slammed a fist into his jaw. He staggered, gasping, but refused to fall. "You'll doom us all," he whispered. Alexis looked at me, eyes brimming with conflicting emotions. I gave the slightest nod. We couldn't let Reeve keep his stranglehold. She clenched her jaw and yanked the lever. The console hissed, lights flashing. Ventilation rerouted to executive wing. An ear-splitting screech resonated in the pipes, as if releasing a pressurized storm. The whistleblower screamed, dropping to his knees. The other infected howled in unison, the sound bouncing off the generator's metal walls. The entire structure trembled, steam pouring from vents. I rushed to Alexis's side, hooking an arm around her waist to steady her. Jackson shouted for us to move. The infected clutched their heads, racked by some violent feedback loop. One soared into a frenzy, flailing at the nearest pipe. Another collapsed, spasming. The whistleblower stared at me one last time, a bleak resignation in his tear-filled eyes. Then he lunged. I had no choice. I swung the axe, connecting with a sickening crack. He crumpled, blood pooling. The shrieking grew louder. Alexis sobbed, covering her ears. Jackson managed to pry open a secondary exit, waving us through. Harriet and Eric, two survivors we'd picked up on the way, called out, urging us to hurry. "Go!" I shouted, hauling Alexis toward them. The infected in the generator room were lost to their thrashing. Some tearing at the floor, others contorting in pain. It was as if rerouting the gas had triggered a cataclysmic reaction. The meltdown alarm, once faint, now howled through the loudspeakers. Catastrophic failure imminent. Executive override required. We spilled into a corridor, wincing as the door slammed behind us. On the other side, inhuman shrieks reverberated, metal scraping on metal. My shoulder burned from the exertion. Alexis trembled against me, her breath ragged, infection raging in her bloodstream. Yet she clung to me with the last of her will. "You did the right thing," I whispered, though part of me wasn't sure if I believed it. She nodded numbly. We'd bought ourselves a chance, maybe a short one. Reeve was now ground zero for an onslaught of concentrated vigilant gas. If it killed him and his executive circle, the meltdown might be averted. But if he survived, he'd be unstoppable. Everywhere we saw evidence of meltdown. Steam bursting from vents, circuit boxes sparking. Entire sections of the warehouse blacked out. Our group pressed onward, clinging to the dim hope that if we could find Reeve and stop him, we might prevent the final seal that would doom every survivor still breathing. When we reached the executive wing, a hush lay over everything. The usual hustle of polished shoes and managerial chatter was replaced by silent halls, decorated with motivational posters, now spattered with bloody handprints. A half-broken espresso machine spilled cold coffee across the tile. We gathered outside the main boardroom doors, breath hitching in our throats. Alexis clutched my sleeve. I pushed the doors open, revealing a long conference table illuminated by emergency lanterns. Around it sat men and women in impeccable business suits, posture unnervingly rigid. Their faces were pale, cheeks sunken, eyes half-lidded. It looked like a meeting from hell, everyone motionless as though time had paused. Yet their gazes shifted to track us as we entered. At the head of the table lounged Brendan Reeve, toying with a small remote device. His suit was unbloodied, his tie perfectly aligned, and he offered a calm smile when he noticed us. Behind him, a giant picture window overlooked the warehouse in chaos. The tinted glass glowed with swirling fog from the vent reroute, but he showed no sign of alarm. "Frank," he said softly. "And Alexis, you're just in time." He gestured at the silent undead executives. Our board meeting was missing a few key participants. My pulse hammered at the sight of these half-reanimated suits. Each face blank yet attentive. They were thralls of vigilant gas, but not mindless. Reeve's presence seemed to anchor them. "Stop the meltdown," I growled. "Let everyone else go." He raised an eyebrow. "Now, why would I do that?" Your sabotage forced me to accelerate certain protocols, but the meltdown is only plan B. If you accept your place here at the top, we can unify the infected, keep them from tearing this facility, and each other to pieces. His gaze flicked to Alexis, whose eyes fluttered from the infection. We can save your daughter, Frank. Stabilize her, like we stabilized ourselves. Meltdown at 85%, ticking upward. We had minutes. The undead executives remained eerily silent, though one or two opened their mouths in a faint pantomime, as if trying to speak. Reeve stood, hands clasped behind his back, and approached us with measured steps. This is the future, he said, voice calm. A workforce that doesn't question orders. Executives who retain their intellect even beyond death. Efficiency on a level never seen before. I glanced at Alexis, whose face dripped sweat. She gripped my arm, trying to stay upright. You're insane, Alexis whispered. This isn't progress. It's enslavement. Reeve tilted his head. Words like insanity or enslavement are sentimental. I call it optimization. The meltdown is a fallback. If I can't control every corner of this facility, then I'll bury the evidence and rebuild. Either way, the new order will rise from the ashes. He lifted the small remote in his hand, eyeing it with detachment. A single override button can halt the meltdown. But Frank, you must make a choice. You helped me once before, remember? The forklift accident? Your testimony kept prying investigators at bay. That was the seed of all this. His smile edged with mock sympathy. It's fitting you stand at this crossroads now. Guilt flared white hot in my mind. Part of me wanted to sink to my knees, undone by shame. But Alexis squeezed my arm, her breath ragged, and I remembered every principle I once had, everything she fought for. End it, I demanded. Or will kill me, Reeve finished, amused. Then meltdown proceeds, condemning every survivor left. And Alexis, she'll soon be fully infected. Your call, Frank. We stared at each other in the hush. The board members watched impassively, some half-slumped, but their eyes never left us. Alexis let out a broken gasp, her body jolting as if an electrical current ran through her veins. Dad, it's in my head, she choked, tears streaming. He's calling to me. My arms can barely resist. She jerked forward a step. Reeve's smile widened. You feel it, don't you, child? The chain of command. Your father could anchor you if he stands with me, or you can both perish in meltdown. A roar of fury built inside me. I hefted the fire axe, my old shoulder injury flaring. Two of the undead executives stirred, rising from their chairs with languid grace, as though they sensed violence. Reeve tapped the remote. A small countdown flashed on a side screen. Meltdown 94%, 95%. Time is almost up, he said softly. Sit, Frank. Let's discuss your promotion. That concludes today's story. If you liked it, please consider subscribing. It would really help me out. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.